The Littorio-class was Italy's last and largest class of battleships. Each was powerfully armed with 9 381mm 15-inch guns, a displacement of over 46,000 tons, and a top speed of 30 knots. They were certainly a match for any battleship in the Middle Sea. There were 4 battleships planned, and 3 were complete. Those that were completed were Littorio, later renamed Italia, Vittorio Veneto, and Roma. Littorio and Vittorio Veneto saw battle, mainly against Allied convoy operations. Of course, most famously for Vittorio Veneto, she took part in the Battle of Cape Matapan in late March 1941. However, as the war developed not necessarily in Italy's favor, the battleship struggled to contribute to the war effort, as did the rest of the Regia Marina due to the worsening fuel situation, and by the summer of 1943, following Operation Torch and the conclusion of the successful campaigns in North Africa, Operation Husky and the Allied capture of Sicily, the Allies were poised to invade the Italian mainland. The war had turned into a war of attrition and exhaustion for Italy and the Regia Marina, costing the nation a significant portion of the fleet, its African colonies, most of its merchant marine, and now Sicily. By August 1943, Benito Mussolini had been deposed and replaced by Pietro Badoglio, a former army chief of staff. Almost at once, he began negotiations with the Allies for an armistice. Badoglio made several changes in the armed forces. Importantly, Admiral Arturo Riccardi, who had been in charge of the Regia Marina, was replaced by Admiral Rafael de Corten, who was not made aware of these negotiations, along with his admirals like Carlo Bergamini, when on the 8th of September was called upon to lead a fleet of Italian battleships, cruisers, destroyers, including his new flagship, the 46,000-ton battleship Roma, to Allied-controlled ports. On the way, the Roma was struck by several German FX 1400 guided bombs and sunk, as was the Italia, but she was not sunk. Still, Vittorio Veneto and Italia would make it to Malta in Allied captivity, where over the coming years they would languish, being eventually scrapped in the 1950s. In today's video, we'll be covering the fates of Italy's last and largest battleships. For the sake of time and me attempting to explain the complexities of the backroom negotiations between the Allies and Italian representatives, we'll move to the night of September the 8th, when at 7:45 p.m., Badoglio announced the armistice with the Allies. De Corten, who had recently learned about the armistice and once coming to terms with the armistice, passed the news to Bergamini with the conditions and the orders to execute them. Bergamini renewed his protest at having everything kept from him, as he had learned from the Allied broadcast made by Dwight D. Eisenhower before Badoglio made his announcement, and said that he was leaning towards scuttling his ships. The two discussed the possibility of moving his ships to La Maddalena to remove the squadron from the German threat. But before leaving, Bergamini called a new meeting of his admirals and commanders to explain the moral sacrifice they were called to make. The meeting began at about 10 p.m. aboard the Vittorio Veneto, the only major warship still linked by telephone to Rome, as the others were moored in the roadstead. Bergamini explained the situation to the officers under his command and the importance of the Navy to the nation. After further conversations with his officers, another conversation with de Corten followed at 11 p.m., which again was also very heated. The admirals were very nervous to move the ships from La Spezia, which was threatened by German troops. Finally, de Corten convinced Bergamini to weigh anchor immediately for La Maddalena, using as leverage the fact that King Victor Emmanuel III would also be there, which was in fact not true, as the planned transfer of the king to Sardinia had overtaken events, as German parachute units were close to occupying critical positions on the island. This was really an expedient to win Bergamini over. In World War II at Sea, A Global History by Craig L. Simmons, he writes about Bergamini's speech to his men. At La Spezia, Admiral Carlo Bergamini, who had succeeded Iachino in command of the Squadra Navale, called his officers together to convince them otherwise. "This is not what we imagined," he told them, "but this is the course by which we must now steer. Because what counts in the history of a people is not dreams and hopes, but the consciousness of duty carried out to the bitter end." De Corten was resigned to sending the ships to Malta. Still, he was highly apprehensive about their ultimate fate, because he had not received any assurances about their possession, so this layover at La Maddalena would serve to buy time to clarify this extremely delicate point. Bergamini consented to leave La Spezia and Genoa with all available ships, including those under repair but capable of movement. Supermarina transmitted the order to Bergamini at 11:45 and called for the naval battle forces to move to La Maddalena for a brief stay. To take from Ermino Bagnesco and Augusto de Toro in their book, the Littorio-class, Italy's last and largest battleships, 1937 to 1948, there, Bergamini was to receive written instructions from Admiral Bruno Brinovesi, which, it is now known, included the order to proceed to Bône and the dispositions of the Dick Memorandum. It is not clear if Bergamini had already had an inkling of these dispositions. At 1:38 a.m. on September 9th, the Commander-in-Chief of the Naval Battle Forces issued the departure order to all subordinate and attached ships as follows. From La Spezia, 9th Division, Roma, flagship of Commander-in-Chief, Naval Battle Forces, Italia, Vittorio Veneto. Cruisers, destroyers, and other torpedo boats came from La Spezia, along with other ships from Genoa, including some light cruisers and torpedo boats. Roma, with Bergamini on board, Italia, and then Vittorio Veneto, left La Spezia in that order, preceded by the 7th Division, Attilo Regolo, and the destroyers. At 3:40 a.m. on the 9th, all ships had passed through the La Spezia barriers and set course to the southwest. The Genoa group weighed anchor at 2:47 a.m. and set a southerly course. Shortly after 6 a.m., north of Cape Rosso, the two groups joined into a single formation, with the light cruisers and torpedo boats falling in line with the others. Navigation of the group proceeded with zigzagging to the southwest and then to the south, along the west coast of Corsica, at a speed no greater than 22 knots, rather than the 24 knots that had been called for due to the Italia's outboard engine condensers. By 9 a.m., additional torpedo boat escorts joined and assumed a scouting position over the horizon ahead of the formation. Taking from Bagnesco and De Toro again, at 9:01 on the 9th, Supermarina transmitted the order to execute Commando Supremo's Memorandum No. 1, which called for resistance against the Germans. But during the night, Bergamini had already given orders to be on the highest alert against any possible attacks by the Luftwaffe. From 11:50 on the 9th, Supermarina began issuing a clear proclamation of encouragement by De Courten to all Italian naval personnel during this time of extraordinary difficulty. At about 12:30 on the 9th, however, small German units that were already in the waters around La Maddalena easily took over the base using motorized barges and other small craft, ahead of the planned transfer of Wehrmacht units from Sardinia to Corsica. As soon as Supermarina learned of this news, it sent a message to Bergamini and it was received aboard Roma at 2:24 p.m., informing him of the occupation of La Maddalena and ordered him to change course and head to Cape Bône. Bergamini and his ships had entered the Gulf of Asinara at about 12:15, with ships in line ahead formation, with the torpedo boats and destroyers in close escort following the swept channels through the minefields. Orders were given at 2:39 for the first of the torpedo boat groups, and then all of the battle forces at 2:41 to change course, and a simultaneous turn to port occurred. When this was complete, Roma found herself in the trailing position of the 9th Division. At 3:40, Supermarina clarified their orders about sailing to Bône and provided signals for when they encountered Allied ships. This last message was either not deciphered or did not reach Roma before she was fatally hit. Late in the afternoon, while the Italian fleet was steaming northwest, leaving the Gulf of Asinara, an attack began by 28 Dornier Do-217 twin-engine bombers of the 2nd and 3rd groups of the 100th Bomb Wing of the 3rd Luftflotte based in Provence, according to the plan for the neutralization of the Italian armed forces in case of their defection. The German aircraft attacked from an altitude of more than 6,000 meters, or about 20,000 feet, using the PC-1400X armor-piercing guided bombs designed as anti-ship weapons. Bagnesco and De Toro described the bombs as, "This was a weapon that retained the basic shape of a conventional bomb, but had 4 movable tail fins arrayed in an X pattern that were able to modify the bomb's trajectory within certain limits. Directional control of the fins was by radio control from the aircraft that had dropped the bomb. The bomb had no supplementary propulsion system, but there was a luminous flare on the rear of the bomb that enabled the bomb aimer aboard the plane to follow its trajectory. The weapon, also known as the Fritz X, weighed 1,570 kilograms, of which 320 kilograms was the explosive charge, and was easily able to pierce armor plate thicker than 130 millimeters from a height of 6,000 meters. The bomb had recently been issued to air units. It had previously been used in the Mediterranean theater and would go on to damage and/or sink other vessels, including the British battleship HMS Warspite, the cruisers USS Savannah, and HMS Uganda. Two of these Fritz X bombs hit Roma at 3:46 and at 3:52. The first in the area of the starboard engine room, the second amidships towards the port side near the bridge tower. The explosion of the second bomb detonated the forward magazine containing the 15-inch propellant charges, and the ship broke in two and sank. A witness from the cruiser Littorio-class remembers the scene vividly. Terrible yellow-red flame bursts out and envelops all the bow of the part of the beautiful ship, while a gigantic pillar of smoke climbs up to several hundred meters into the air, and thousands of pieces of iron blown up now continue to fall into the sea. In the Special Inquest Commission, they say 1,253 men, including Admiral Bergamini and his entire staff, died. Other sources claim numbers closer to 1,400 men died. Other ships were hit, including Italia, at 4:29 towards their bow, causing light damage and flooding. The attacks would continue until 5:50, but no further successful strikes occurred. The light cruiser Littorio-class, destroyers, and torpedo boats were sent to rescue survivors of Roma. The individual squadron commanders independently decided to head for the Balearics and meet there the following day. They rendezvoused off of North Africa, where a British squadron escorted them into Bizerta. The operation's name was a nod to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the code name for the British operation for the reception and escort of the surrendered Italian fleet was Operation Gibbon. The damage to the Roma was quite extensive, as shown through her going down so quickly, and because of that, the damage I discuss comes from the sources in the description and is somewhat speculation. Simmons writes, "The brand new Roma, which had never been in battle or even fired her guns in anger, sank quickly. Bergamini, who had carried out his duty to the bitter end, as promised, was one of the more than 1,300 killed. But the first bomb at 3:46 hit the ship 1 meter from the starboard deck between the 90mm gun mounts 9 and 11, passing through the hull, penetrating 3 armor decks, and probably exploded under the hull in the areas of boilers 7 and 8, between that compartment and the after engine room. The damage would have been the destruction and flooding of boiler rooms 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the starboard aft engine rooms and the adjacent compartments. Collapse of the rangefinder antenna on the starboard 152mm night fire director station, flooding of the internal bulges, voids, balancing cells in the area of the explosion, damage of varying extent to the starboard 90mm battery, damage to the port 90mm mounts, fire towards the ship's stern, and as a result of this attack, electrical power and lights were cut in the aft section, but were quickly restored thanks to the engineers. The second bomb at 3:52 hit the center of the ship between the bridge tower and the second main battery turret, and the number 1 secondary battery turret forward on the port side. The bomb penetrated the 3 armored decks again and most likely exploded in the forward port engine room. Now, there was an interval of about 10 seconds that passed between the bomb's explosion and the explosion of the charges in number 1 turret's magazine and the imposing escape of steam prior to the large smoke cloud following the detonation of the charges in the adjacent main magazine. This lethal bomb caused the following damage as Bagnesco and De Toro describe: destruction and flooding of the forward port engine rooms, deflagration of the propellant charges in the forward port main gun magazine, deflagration of the propellant charges in the magazine of number 2 main turret, and hurling the turret weighing almost 1,600 tons into the sea. Probable deflagration of the propellant charges in the magazine of number 1 main turret, leaning of the tower structure forward and to starboard, flooding of the previously cited magazines, huge fires in the forward portion of the ship, cutting of electrical power throughout the ship, reduction of the metacentric height as a result of the widespread flooding. To take from Bagnesco and De Toro again, the ship's ability to float and her stability had already been compromised by the first bomb. In the few minutes before the fatal blow, the port list had been contained by automatic balancing to starboard and transfer of water to several of the port side cells. By the time the second bomb hit, The list had been reduced to 2 degrees, but the ship's stability was already critical because of the numerous spaces that were open to the sea or that were otherwise flooded. The explosion of the forward magazines compromised the situation. It was possible as long as the explosion was not vented upward, but instead exerted a downward pressure, that it might keep the flooding in check in the affected spaces. Still, after venting upward, it accelerated the flooding due to the suction effect. The ship began to heel over to starboard, temporarily steadying following the forward flooding at a list of 10 to 12 degrees and with the forecastle deck edge 50 from the water. It was in these few minutes that most of the survivors, almost all of them from the stern sections, were able to save themselves by jumping into the water. The ship soon resumed her starboard heel, the deck edge disappeared under the surface, and the ship turned over on her starboard side as the water flowed into the other spaces, through the breach made by the first bomb, and through the open barbette of number 2 turret on the forecastle deck, and the shifting of large volumes of liquids in the hull. As soon as she turned over, Roma broke in two at the point where she had been hit by the second bomb, which had put tremendous stress on the structure, as had the explosions of the propellant magazines and the flooding once the ship had turned over. The effect of the flooding was reversed. The upper decks, which were built to withstand the compression forces, were now subjected to totally opposite stress forces and gave way. All of the other longitudinal members, which had already been under great stress, also gave way as a result. Roma disappeared beneath the surface at 4:15 p.m. with an extremely high loss of life, as I mentioned earlier. Officially, there were 1,253 dead, including Vice Admiral Carlo Bergamini and his entire staff. There were no survivors from the areas forward of the tower, except for one signalman. There were 596 survivors, almost all of whom were from the aft sections. Losses could have been significantly higher if the ship and her structure had not withstood the blast and the flooding for almost 20 minutes, allowing enough time to save them. One last thing from Bagnesco and De Toro. Penetration of all of the armored decks by both bombs does not reflect any particular weakness of the horizontal protection. Even considering the mistake of having divided the armor over 3 decks on the class of ships, the battleships of this generation could not have been conceived, designed, and built to withstand such an attack from the air, as at the time, such a drastic and rapid development of the threat could not have been imagined. Now, after maneuvering around, the remnants of the force, including Italia and Vittorio Veneto, they eventually met up with their British counterparts, and with an intense environment, they made it to Malta under the command of Admiral Romeo Oliva with the 7th Division, as in the confused situation, he was the most senior commander of the divisional commanders. Taken from De Toro and Bagnesco again. In Malta, on the morning of September the 11th, 1943, Vittorio Veneto and Italia anchored in the open bay called Maddalena, named after an old watchtower that stands on the coast slightly north of the entrance to the Grand Harbor, while Eugenio de Savoia anchored a bit farther south near the battleship Duilio, Admiral de Zara's flagship. Later, all of the major Italian warships were concentrated in the large roadstead of Marsa Scirocco, on the island's southern coast. In a meeting with Admiral Cunningham, de Zara, who had assumed command of all Italian ships, obtained an easing of the armistice terms. In fact, the British sailors were removed from guard duty aboard the Italian ships, and security measures became the responsibility of the individual ship commanders. On September 13th, the battleship Giulio Cesare arrived from Taranto, and the following morning, the bulk of the Italian fleet left Malta for Alexandria. The group included Vittorio Veneto and Italia, the light cruisers Eugenio de Savoia, flagship of Admiral Oliva, who was senior Italian officer at sea, Montecuccoli, Duca d'Aosta, and Cardona. At sea, the formation deployed in 3 parallel lines, Vittorio Veneto and Italia in the center, Montecuccoli and Cardona to starboard, and Eugenio de Savoia and Duca d'Aosta to port, with the destroyers escorting the sides. During the passage between Malta and Alexandria, the formation was followed by the British battleships Howe, flagship of Vice Admiral Arthur J. Power, and King George V, escorted by 6 destroyers, among which was the Greek Vassilia Olga. These were the same battleships that on September 9th had taken part in the landing operation at Taranto, Operation Slapstick. The ship sailed at 22 knots and with frequent zigzags. On the morning of the 15th, Vittorio Veneto and Italia changed positions in line. The Italian ships reached Alexandria shortly after midday on the 16th, and anchored in the roadstead in the early afternoon. They remained at the British base for about a month, berthing in the port for a brief period to offload their ammunition. A very sad period began for the personnel because these conditions of decommission were much harsher than they had been at Malta. An armed guard was placed aboard each ship, and the ships were forbidden to communicate with each other. All of this was happening while cooperation between the British and Italian navies had been established by Cunningham and de Courten. Crew morale plummeted because they were not allowed to go ashore, because of the difficulty obtaining supplies, especially water, an unfavorable climate, and because of the inactivity, the uncertain future, and the inflexible and contemptuous attitude of the British authorities. The ship's commanders did their best to cope by organizing sporting events, conferences, and shows to keep up the men's spirits. During this period, 3 attempted desertions were quickly foiled by the Egyptian police, who returned the deserters to their commands as soon as they had swum ashore. On October 13, 1943, the Italian government in Brindisi declared war on Germany and thus began the Italian co-belligerency with the Allies. On the same date, some Italian ships in Malta had already reached Italian bases, followed on the 16th by ships in Alexandria, returning to Italy on the 18th, except for the largest 2 battleships, which by the long armistice were destined for internment in the Great Bitter Lake, the largest saltwater lakes between Port Said and Suez on the canal. Vittorio Veneto and Italia, with their officers and crews reduced by half, weighed anchor from Alexandria late in the afternoon on October 16th, where they reached Port Said on the 17th. The 2 ships remained there for almost 3.5 years, completely inactive in a desolate setting, an interesting situation as other Italian ships were either more or less operational again or were stationed in Italian ports. Although the crews weren't entirely idle, as aboard Italia, they used this period to strengthen the structures that had been damaged by the German bomb on September 9, 1943, with assistance from British divers and materials aboard. However, in truth, the British were happy to find any fragments of the guided bomb. In this 3.5-year period, there was a rotation of commanders, officers, and crews, as well as provisions of necessary supplies taken to them by Italian warships. In July 1945, in a move designed to gain the goodwill of the victors, and in particular, to gain the status of a fully fledged ally, the Italian government in Rome declared war on Japan, in which Admiral de Courten discussed the possibility of the remaining Italian fleet, namely the 2 Vittorio Veneto-class battleships, 7 or 8 cruisers, destroyers, and torpedo boats, submarines as well as the Italian Marines, should be sent to the Far East. Granted, the fleet, namely the 2 battleships, would need time to work up and have some repairs. They wouldn't be ready until at least 1946. Plus, with questions about the reliability of Italian ships in the Pacific and other questions, it seemed unlikely that the Italian fleet would be sent east. Still, it wouldn't matter as Japan would surrender in early August 1945 and the 2 Littorios would be left to sit around. Taking from De Toro and Bagnesco again, on February 10, 1947, Italy signed the peace treaty with the victorious powers in Paris. This imposed heavy territorial, material, and moral sacrifices that certainly did not spare the Navy, which greeted the treaty in a decisively negative manner, as its terms had swept away all of the illusions generated by its active collaboration with the Allied cause from September 8th onwards. The major source of bitterness derived from the fact that the treaty disposed of the Italian fleet as war booty to be divided amongst the victors, whose bickering over the spoils was clear as early as 1944 when Moscow quickly asked for the share of Italian ships it was owed. The Italian government and navy had always hoped that, aside from compensation to the powers from which the warships had been taken and not returned, Italy would be left with a nucleus of ships adequate for essential defense requirements and at the same time would apply to new construction. Instead, not only was it left with a fleet inadequate for its estimated needs both in numbers and in quality, but the impositions and limitations introduced for the future were just as restrictive, if not more so. About the battleships, Vittorio Veneto and Italia were respectively assigned to Britain and the United States, Cesare to the Soviet Union, while the other 2 Duilios remained in Italian hands. Once these 2 ships were decommissioned, Italy would no longer be allowed to have battleships, nor to possess guns with ranges greater than 30,000 meters. While the treaty was being drawn up, the Italian government, which took no part in negotiations, tried unsuccessfully through a series of memoranda and declarations in April, July, August, and September 1946 to ease the terms that the 21 victorious powers were defining concerning the Navy. In particular, it sought to preserve the two Vittorio Venetos as training ships, pointing out, in addition to the sacrifices and contributions that the Italian Navy had made to the Allied cause, the symbolic value of these ships to the Italian Navy and to Italy itself, and the negative impact on the public opinion and on Navy personnel that ceding them would cause. The failure of every attempt to gain better treatment, which continued even after Italy signed the treaty, prompted Admiral Rafael de Corten to tender his resignation as Chief of General Staff on December 31st, 1946, having given up his post as Navy Minister earlier on July 14th. This act marked the failure of the political calculation that had inspired his actions. From the eve of the September 8th armistice, to preserve the Navy and the nucleus of its fleet from defeat through the changing of alliances to active collaboration with the victors, and not least, detachment from the monarchy through tacit compliance in June 1944 with new procedure for swearing in ministers that ignored the figure of the king, even though in 1943 he had stressed the validity of the oath to the king when de Corten appealed to have the officers and crews honor the painful armistice clauses. Further negotiations led to the British relinquishing their claim on Vittorio Veneto and other ships they desired. A few days before signing the peace treaty, Italia left the Great Bitter Lake to return to Italy. She sailed up the canal to Port Said, where she reached it on the same day and refueled. Early on the morning of the 6th, she left port for Augusta in Sicily, which she reached on the morning of the 9th. During the passage, the 37mm and 20mm guns conducted gunnery exercises. After 3.5 years of inactivity, the engines worked perfectly, registering only a higher consumption rate only due to the effect of the hole in the distorted bow that reduced the efficiency of the hull. Vittorio Veneto left the Bitter Lakes 2 days later, on February 7th, and entered Augusta on the morning of the 9th. At the Sicilian base, the two ships remained inactive, anchored in the roadstead until October 1947, when they steamed out in what turned out to be their last voyage on the 15th of October 1947, eventually heading to La Spezia on the morning of the 29th. At La Spezia, Vittorio Veneto and Italia then moored at the Scaglia Quay in the Duca degli Abruzzi Basin and were decommissioned on January 3rd and June 1st, 1948, respectively. There they remained with ever smaller crews, stripped of materials that could be useful elsewhere. The demolition or dismantling proceeded slowly by veiled guidance by the naval staff, aimed at buying time in an attempt to save the ships if at all possible. Finally faced with all the delays, the Naval Armistice Commission of the four major powers decreed, without further procrastination, the 381mm gun barrels and main steam pipes be cut with torches and that the turbines and reduction gears be destroyed by the applicable provisions of the peace treaty. In this state, the two battleships remained for several years until 1951, when in June and December, the hulks of Vittorio Veneto and Italia were sold to the breakers who finished the work. I should also mention that the United States and the Italians came to an agreement where the United States relinquished their claims to the parts of the Italian fleet that they wanted. Roma, Vittorio Veneto, and Italia were beautiful ships, and their fates were all very interesting in their own right. Still, of course, the loss of Roma was particularly sad with the loss of so many lives. In the future, we'll look at some of Italy's other ships, most likely the Littorio-class, as their fates are also very interesting. Thank you for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it will help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have an amazing week.